I had heard of many stories and rumors that there was a secret hidden story behind the Willy Wonka story, but I never really had believed in them. I thought of them as nothing more than mere jokes in our fan fiction. You know how people like to take things that are normally thought to be happy and whimsical, like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and label Wonka as a child predator or some shit like that. I never took anything like that seriously and just thought of them to be things that people with active, albeit creative, minds have come up with. To me, the Wonka story was nothing more than a happy and innocent story made for children to enjoy. At least that was what I thought until the day I decided that I would actually find out the way and find a way for myself. I decided to mail someone who was once acquainted by Da. I was told not to give anything his person anyway, just to see if any of this was true. Considering nearly everyone had said something about this story, obviously having some sort of subtext about it, I thought that I would check just to be sure. I was told in the mail, and I quote, "You seemed interested in the subject. Many prefer to speculate, but you're the first one who is seemingly genuinely curious. Seeing as if you want to know as much as you do, I'll send you the tape in the mail. Check within a week." It was a couple days or so later when the tape finally arrived. It had the words, "The True Story Behind or of Willy Wonka," written on it in black marker. The only other words on there were copyright date 1963, a year before the book had came out. At first I thought it was strange, considering that VHS tapes were not around back then. This occurred to me that it was possible that it had been on film and put on tape later. So I stuck the tape in and played it, after rewinding just to be sure. It started out a bit odd. For one thing, it immediately cut to the title, taken directly from the first edition book cover. With no fade, it just sort of popped in, causing me to jump. What also made me jump was what came after that, the late yet abrupt appearance of the music, which sounded loud and sounded like some angry fast jazz music. Anyway, I went down to the credits and slow showed names that I've never seen before. The only names I was able to recognize were Dal's, Patricia's, Neil's, and some guy named John Black. It kept looping back to the names of the animation checker about 15 times. I generally thought that this was something wrong with the tape. Right was when I went to take it out. It popped immediately into the outside of the house of the buckets, with the camera zooming in. The art style was really weird. It was black and white, and it had an odd, misty, cloudy look to it, cross-hatched. There was a deep male voice that seemed to be most likely the narrator, but his voice was in horrible quality. It muffled at such a low volume that I could barely make out the word he was saying. It then cut inside of the bucket's house, and the misty, cloudy look was even weirder here. People moved all wavery-like and wouldn't stop moving. Much more like those Zelda CDI games, with the shading was cross-hatched, which meant that there were a lot of extra movement. Sometimes it was hard to even make out what was going on. The characters behaved oddly. It seemed like Charlie was gay or highly effeminate as he spoke with a girly voice, and it spoke for loves for dolls and princesses. It seemed that everyone feared Grandpa Joe. We found out later that he was involved in World War I. It is never explained how, but it seems clear that he was responsible for ending it. Charlie's parents, who also displayed odd behavior. The dad seemed depressed and the mom seemed paranoid and suffered from a major form of obsessive-compulsive disorder. The other grandparents never spoke at all. From here on, it is not too different from the book, except for the characters and the fact that Charlie sings songs about his dress he wishes to wear. The story about Wonka is also slightly different. Apparently he is a Grinch and he happened to be out of nowhere, suddenly owning an impressive factory that no one saw built. It seemed that no one worked on his factory, nor did it have any problems causing it to shut down. But when Charlie finds the ticket, it happens halfway through the finding. Also, we don't see any of the other kids giving their interviews as they win, and the message from the ticket, found in the book or any other film adaptation, is absent. In fact, the ticket is blank. No mention of being gold, but it's black and white, so it is hard to tell anyway. So anyway, the big day came and everyone was waiting at the gate. Very similar to the book version, except there are 6 kids and Charlie is wearing his dress and his lines are spoken by the people are slightly changed from the book halfway through. There are talks of Wonka being a Grinch and how his factory got here and how it got made. Also, there is a story about Prince Pondicherry's death, having died drowning in Wonka's chocolate palace. They talk about more stuff, but then it seems the wind picks up, drowning them out. Through nothing is ever seen blowing, just the sound effect of howling wind. There are even bells that chime when it's time for the gates to open, just like in the book. Surprisingly, I can hear it over the loud howling wind, but then it hits me that the chimes are not like church bells like the book describes. They're funeral bells. Very weird, but this is not the weirdest part. The weirdest part is Wonka himself. When the door swung open, you could see a dark shadowy figure stand at the doorway, and then Wonka comes out of the factory, hopping and prancing. He certainly does not appear human, although it is somewhat hard to tell due to the style of crotch hatching and the lack of color. Again, this isn't the weirdest part. The weirdest part is his eyes. He had a reptilian stare that quite literally sent chills down my spine. His hair kept on moving, not because of the consistent motion and cross-hatching, it just moved like he was underwater. The wind was even louder now, and he pranced and hopped down towards the gates. Once he arrived, he spoke. Strangely, I could hear his voice loud and clear, even though through the cheering and talking from the audience was barely audible. His voice was also high, like explained in the book, but not the kind of high voice I expected it. He sounded like Michael Jackson, speaking seductively. And as normal, the kids all had to show him their tickets, which he struck down his pants, and they walked inside. It wasn't any different from the book from here on out, except for when they stared down in the hallways, which looked like it's a demented Tim Burton-style artwork. They kept getting more narrow and kept slooping down and even further as they went. They also seemed to have twisted more as they entered each new hallway. The weirdest part is that there was no dialogue except a line from Veronica about needing to use the loo, which her father tells her it probably won't happen till the end of the tour. There is also a low rising of the howling winds from earlier. I found it strange that such a thing would appear inside the factory. They entered even more twisted and looped-looking hallway, with funeral bells chiming once again. The odd thing is that the art style, once they entered this room, had changed completely. While still remaining cross-hatched and wavery animated, it was now fully looked like something Tim Burton might have drawn. The narrator from earlier also returned, but he was somewhat clearer. I could tell it was the same voice clip from earlier, as I recognized some of the inflections. Oddly, he didn't seem to have been talking about the buckets like I would have expected for the intro. I still find him hard to make out. I managed to catch a few words such as Grinch, Wonka, and something he went on about the Oompa Loompas. At this point I had goosebumps. I actually did not want to know what he was trying to say here, but I was still very curious. When everything got interrupted by a long message found on a black screen with white text, the writing on it was in another language. It looked like an odd mixture between Greek and Korean, but somehow managed to look like a black Adler ITC font. There was no sound at all here. Everything was in total silence, through the howling winds to show up abruptly. A few minutes in, I expected for it to return to the show here, but it went on for a few more minutes before it went back to the actual movie. They continued to walk down through the twisted halls, and this one particularly messy with the shadowy figures and Wonka and the gang walking through. It changed to a side view of everyone still back in black and shadowy, and Wonka was still hopping down until an abrupt change as the funeral bells sounded again. Then he was walking slowly. Then there was his walking reminded me very much of the Undertaker from WWF, especially the Ministry of Darkness days. Other than the obvious, what was also freaky about it was the fact that it happened abruptly with no traditional frames. There was again no dialogue here from one of the kids, I assume was a girl, saying, "I don't like this, Daddy." Suddenly they walked through into the chocolate room. No door or entrance, they just walked in. All sound is gone, and each one that actually shows up is distant and echoey. When they get here, it starts to get really strange. The room looks eerily identical to the one from the 2005 Tim Burton film adaptation, and it is not crosshatched, but it does look like a black and white painting art style. The Chocolate River. This is one of the most unsettling moments because the river looked like real blood. The only colored element of the entire film. Not blood done in a realistic style, but as if though someone actually dipped a brush into a cup of blood and ran a brush across those parts. What made it more unsettling was that the text features that it would change slightly with each frame. Quite unsettling because of how they were able to get so much blood to make up for each possibility 700,000 more pieces of paper. But that isn't the weirdest part. It gets worse. The room doesn't seem to be function as normal, like Wonka is not introducing anyone to the room or showing them around. He suddenly starts speaking about the Oompa Loompas, a group of black pygmies that he smuggled from a deep dark forest in Africa. Illegally, he adds. When they are shown, but the unsettling part is the fact that unlike the book, where they're happy and cheerful and always singing and laughing, they look miserable. And each time they look at Wonka, they look terrified, and they gave him a look that basically says, "Please, don't kill me." I actually heard one of them say that, although I couldn't really quite tell if he said kill, as he was far away and was sobbing. It had more of the sound of act rather than kill. The camera then, from this point on, stayed on the bird's eye view. Wonka then yelled angrily at the Oompa Loompas in a ridiculously loud voice. It was loud, high-pitched, and screechy. I couldn't even understand him. He could have been speaking in another language for all I know. When he turned back to his guests and said something about them that sounded so shockingly and despicably racist. But then it just continued to get worse. By the end, he ended up saying about them was plain abysmal, as well as slightly terrifying. I won't even repeat it. It was so bad that even a white supremacist would be offended by it. Now that I'm not that super sensitive, politically correct type that thinks blacks can do no wrong, not a racist either, but even I was distraught about what he had just said. The salts were revealed to be racists, not surprisingly, but even they were offended. Anyway, the old Viking boat arrived, but it had some odd reptilian designs about it. The gang got in, and I heard Veruca say, "Daddy, I want lots of things, but I don't want a dreadful boat like this." But that was all I could hear. The gang did talk, but their voices were drowned out by a group of crying Oompa Loompas, and the overly loud sailing of the boat in the chocolate blood river. They ended up going through a dark tunnel. It was very close to the one with the film with Gene Wilder. You know, that psychedelic tunnel ride? But I could barely make out what any of them were saying as the style made everything look convoluted. Veruca commented about her underpants being drenched in pee. The sixth child was another girl who spoke some of Violet's lines from the film. What is this, a freak out? I was absolutely baffled as to who this was, although I noticed Augustus was gone, although I assumed he fell into the chocolate river. Anyway, Wonka sang his rowing song like in the film, although he sang it closer to how Marilyn Manson sang it, but with extra vibrato. The fast, angry jazz music came back and the intro shows up once again. It seems to be odd and out of place. I kept seeing the letters JB popped up in the background. John Black? And then the images became clearer. The background images showed Oompa Loompas crying, and some were singing in something in what some like African language. Then Wonka starts singing and turning into some kind of bizarre language. It sounded like a Yiddish chant, until halfway through, where it starts to have a slight hint of German in it. His eyes got bigger, and his mouth grows larger, and his teeth a sudden change from being sharp and snake-like. Then it pauses right on his face for a few minutes, and then the funeral bells return. The narrator from the beginning shows up again, but halfway through rather than starting out from the beginning. His voice was now very clear. He mentions the Oompa Loompas being illegally smuggled from a deep dark forest in Africa and what peaceful lives they lived. But there was shocking mention of horrid things Mr. Wonka did to smuggle them. Again, I will not repeat them. He is about to speak of what happened to them and how his factory got there, but immediately skips to a room where I could barely make out anything going on. Had no one had said anything about it, I would have never guessed it was the eventing room. From there on, it just keeps skipping to different rooms, a child disappearing each time. Here, however, it seemed that no one knew how they disappear. The sixth child, I still don't know who she is, but I heard someone refer to her as Miranda, unless that was the name of one of the parents, who are mostly unnamed in the book, but I am pretty sure they were referring to this as this mysterious sixth character. At least she spoke when the name was said, but there were funeral bells here, so it was hard to tell if she responded to them. Anyway, the last room they appeared in features Wonka making sick powder. The sixth girl doesn't seem very pleased about it, and Wonka gets extremely angry about this and shouts angrily right in her face. Once again, loud, screechy, and unintelligible. The fact that it was not a distant, it made it even worse. It sounded so loud that it even echoed through the room. The girl then runs inside the door where it's being made, and then it cuts to Wonka's face zooming in closer and closer. He has a huge grinnish, devilish grin about him. Very spooky. I hated to keep looking, but I had to see what was to become, so I reluctantly did so. Some weird noises that resemble one of those creepy background sounds or music you hear something like the History Channel. Maybe you know what I'm talking about or are heard, but they're kind of muted and muffled sounding. Wonka's face, once it zooms closer, it starts to show some disturbing texture that looks kind of reptilian. It appears that his eyes are getting wider, his pupils slowly morph into slits, and his teeth once again become sharp and snake-like. Then everything goes silent in the black with the white text appears once again, looking last time half Greek and half Korean. Then Wonka began to chant something what sounded like Yiddish. It was clearly a different chant than last time. Then it showed hints of German in it, a bit more so than last time. The text then flickered to an English transition, but it happened way too fast. Too fast for me to stop and read it, that is. Then it went back to where it was, and still a picture of the group, still standing around the room with nothing but funeral bells being heard. It lasted for a few minutes, and then it goes up into motion again. Once the funeral bells sounded, I then heard someone who shouted, "Miranda!" So that was her name. Anyway, these two ran into the room as Wonka stared down at Charlie. Honestly, I had particularly forgotten he was there because he was barely shown throughout the whole thing. In fact, Violet and this mysterious Miranda girl were shown the most. I almost felt like Mike and Violet were not even this one, considering their names were never spoken. I also forgotten that he was in a dress. I probably thought it was Violet or something. I heard him speak again, and remembered that he was gay or highly effeminate, as Wonka went on telling him that he won. But instead of taking him directly through the great glass elevator or whatever, he told him to wait a minute. Then he hopped off into another room. He found every one of the kids there except for Miranda. He said something that I did not quite understand. It was English, but it had a rather convoluted meaning. The children were lying on the floor, could be heard crying and moaning, similar to the Oompa Loompas. The parents could not be seen anywhere. Then he turned on the radio and slowly began to strip. The one thing that gave me goosebumps was what was playing on the radio. Melodically, it reminded me a lot of one of those songs you hear from an old Mario game when you fight Bowser, despite it being that a typical style that you often hear during the early 60s, such as the Beatles and the Monkees. But this was only one singer. It also sounded like for the keyboardist didn't know exactly how to play it right. But that wasn't the weirdest part. The weirdest part is this. Now it sounded like it distorted, like an old radio, like if it was from the 60s, and was more in the background, so it was a little hard to hear. Also because it wasn't super loud. Anyway, I couldn't pick up the exact lyrics, but I did hear him mention some freaky shit that would happen to a bunch of different people by 2014. It was like a bunch of random names being splurted out, but he obviously didn't seem to know who they were, or that they were going to happen to them is too horrible to mention. I don't even remember half of them. It took me a second for me to sink back into the video as my mind drifted away, absolutely stunned by the music. When it did, I saw Wonka took off his shirt and throw it off, then finally dropped to the ground slowly. After the credits, all sound was gone from there. Appearing once again were the odd names from the intro. I kept rolling to see if anything came on after this, only to find a message placed at the end what seemed to have been put on later. As the quality and the style, it looked like it had an early 90s feel to it. It read, "Don't let Felicity know," and then the tape stopped. I didn't know who Felicity was until I looked it up and found out that it was the name of Dal's second wife. As you may guess, I was quite shocked by what I have seen, but also relatively confused about what any of this was. I then went and asked the person who has sent me this tape, and he also told me. Obviously, this was how Dal originally read in the book. He always made films of these books before he wrote them, so you could keep in track of every idea he had. He also checked to see if any of the lines where the characters spoke worked outside of just being read. What happened from there on and how it ended up here, I really do not know, and I don't know him that long enough. But I started to question the man after I had got a hold of his tape. I then asked the person if they wanted the tape, but they refused and seemed glad enough to get rid of it. Although they did not want it to be gone forever, they still wanted proof and information to stick around. Ever since I saw this tape, I have been looking around to see if I can get any information on it anywhere, and so far, I could not seem to find anything.